Where does yoga come from? The Veda. So continuing the consideration of yoga in the context of the Vedic tradition and Veda. So with this video, I'm going to refer to the darśana-s sheet. So it'd be nice if you have that one to hand. So yoga is one of the 6 darshanas. Now, darshana is from the verb, like you've heard that word drishti, I imagine, the gaze point. So darshan is a way of looking. A philosophical system, so it's like a viewpoint on reality. So Veda, we've mentioned that these are these revealed texts, and they are revered texts. There's the idea that to make it into the Veda, there's the idea that people thought, well, these were things that were really worth setting down. And you can imagine thousands of years ago when you had to inscribe things on palm leaves, it took quite a lot of effort. So people generally set down things that they thought were worthwhile. Now, the Vedic tradition is based on these 4 Vedas, these 4 texts, which you can see on this sheet at the top. We've got the Rig Veda, maybe say Rig Veda, and Rig, like the K becomes a G when it joins together. This is one of the rules. It's called sandhi in Sanskrit. So often the ending of a word just changes slightly to make it easier to pronounce. So Rig Veda, Yajur Veda, Sama Veda, and Atharva Veda. Sometimes people talk about 3 Vedas, Rig, Sama, Yajur, and then some of them talk about 4 Vedas, including the Atharva Veda. The Vedic tradition is the tradition that grew out of the context in which those collections of texts were set down. So on this sheet, you'll see below it says there are sections of the Vedic literature. The Samhita, which means collections of hymns. And then later in the Vedic literature, we have the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and then the Upanishads. So basically, the Rig Veda Samhita is the collection of the hymns of this text. The Sama Veda is always sung. In the Sama Veda, everything is recited in a certain way. And then the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and the Upanishads, these are kind of later parts of the Vedic literature. And it's really in the Upanishads, and a little bit in the Brahmanas and the Aranyakas, that we start to get more, let's say, this practical philosophy. The hymns, they are often venerating nature through gods that represent the forces of nature. So inherent in the Vedic system is a great respect for the natural world, which I think was the case in all ancient cultures, because you can imagine if you depend on the turning of the seasons, and if you can't buy food at the supermarket, if you depend on the land around you or that you move through, you have to pay close attention to the natural cycles. You have to be much more respectful than many of us have needed to be in our lifetimes. There are still people who do live like that, but in recent times we're in this very unusual and to a large degree unprecedented situation in recent decades and centuries, where we've become very distanced and disconnected from the natural rhythms of life. But the Vedic culture, this incredible culture that developed thousands of years ago in the lands that we now call India, or the Indian subcontinent, and spread throughout Asia, particularly up into the lands above the Indus Valley, and then out into what is now called Southeast Asia and East Asia. For example, if you go to Indonesia or you go to Thailand, you can still see very readily traces of Vedic culture, or aspects of Vedic culture that are still very much practiced, that are still very alive in those cultures. So for example, in Indonesia, in Bali, for example, I had the opportunity to visit one time when I was working in Thailand, people still, on a daily basis, practice this reverence for the gifts of nature in many of the things that they do every day. Like in the morning, they give thanks and they give offerings to the spirits of the land. In Thailand, for example, Thailand's still a monarchy, and that system of monarchy is based on the Vedic system of monarchy. For example, and the Ramayana, one of the great epics of the Indian tradition, there are Ramayana, versions of Ramayana all through Asia. This is just to say that this Vedic culture, or this Indic culture, we could also call it more broadly, was not just confined to the land we now call India. The lands of Bharata, that are sometimes referred to as Bharatavarsha, this spread through a lot of what we now call Asia. Now, notice there I mentioned the difference between Vedic culture and Indic culture. If we talk about Vedic culture, we're talking about the orthodox, mainstream, classical, Sanskrit, Indian culture. And Indic culture is broader. It also includes the tantric texts and some of the unorthodox schools that are not included in the Vedic body of texts or the Vedic corpus of knowledge. Now, when we talk about the Vedic body of texts or the Vedic corpus of knowledge, different people have different opinions about it, but it doesn't just mean the hymns and the hymns and the Brahmanas, Aranikas and Upanishads associated with the four Vedas. If you look on the sheet, you'll see there are also the Vedangas, these limbs of the Veda, and there are texts associated with them, and the Upavedas, and there are the darśana-s. So, and as well as the Vedangas and Upavedas that are mentioned on this sheet, there are also other areas of Indian knowledge, known as Shastras, which are still very much considered part of the Indian tradition because they've grown out of this context. So when we talk about the Vedic tradition, I would say we're speaking about a culture, a system of knowledge or systems of knowledge that have grown out of that original source. They are contextually related to the culture in which the Vedas were set down, if that makes sense. So yoga is definitely part of the Vedic tradition, but yoga is very special because yoga has this key role in the broader Indic tradition, also in the tantric tradition. So in non-orthodox, non-Vedic Indian lineages, yoga is still very present and very important. Yoga is, after all, that which connects, that which links. So it has a very special place in most systems of Indian knowledge and many schools of Indian philosophy. Speaking of schools of philosophy, if we look at the top of the sheet, here we've got the four Vedas, and around them we've got these 6 schools, these 6 darshanas. These are the classical schools of orthodox Indian philosophy. And there are some who have held the position that these are 6 almost like warring factions, a view which some people disagree with entirely. My teacher, my first teacher, and almost all of the teachers that I have worked with subsequently, all consider that really these 6 darshanas, these 6 schools, are mutually complementary. Because coming back to yoga, yoga's practical, and it recognizes that when we have but 2 eyes, there'll always be more that we cannot see than we can. So we can never see the whole truth as a human being. It's very hard. But we can each shine some light on a bigger picture of the truth, if that makes sense. If, for example, we were sitting together in a room in a circle and there was an object in the middle of the circle, and this object was different shapes from different perspectives, we could ask each person to describe it, and they could all tell the truth, but they could all tell us something different about it. So the idea is these different ways of looking at reality that are the 6 darshanas, they help give us a fuller picture of reality. So the first pair of these 6 traditional schools is called Tarka. The second pair is called Sankhya Yoga, and the third pair is called Mimamsa or Vedanta. First pair, Tarka, Nyaya and Vaisheshika. Now Nyaya, this is the system of logic and epistemology. It's a logical place to start, yeah? So Nyaya is the Indian system of logic, and it's very, very thorough. It's more thorough than the Western logic from the Latin Greek tradition. And they say in the Indian tradition that Nyaya is a cow with a tiger's face. This beautiful expression. What does that mean? It means that it's got a tiger's face. It's very forbidding, but really it's a cow. If you can penetrate through the face, then she will give you, she has so much to give you. She is munificent, like the cow. The cow who is revered in India, because not only does she feed her own young, and when she gives birth, demonstrate perfectly or powerfully what's called vatsalya in Sanskrit, this unconditional love when she cleanses her baby calf. But once she's fed her calf, she will share the rest of her milk to feed other species. So the cow is considered this emblem or this symbol, this living symbol of the munificence of Mother Nature. But they say Nyaya is a cow with a tiger's face. When you begin studying Nyaya, the logic, is quite tough going. But once you stick at it, if you become established in that very robust way of examining things, then it allows you to work with any system of knowledge much more easily, because you've been very well prepared. You've been very kind of conditioned, trained in how to consider things more broadly. So it sets a person up to be able to look in ways that reach beyond his or her habitual way of looking more easily. And so it's a great foundation for yoga. And in some schools of yoga, Tarka is one of the limbs. Like you were familiar with the Ashtanga, the 8 limbs. In some tantric schools, Tarka is one of the limbs. There's the idea that you have to have that capacity to engage with source texts and information discerningly, clearly, so one can use them skillfully. So Nyaya is logic and epistemology. How do we decide if something is real or not? What are valid means of knowledge? So in yoga, there are three valid means of knowledge are recognized. Pratyaksha, which literally means in front of the eye. It's direct perception. And I think almost all schools of philosophy accept this means of knowledge. If you can see it with your own eyes, this is a means of determining if something is real or not. Of course, one can have misperception, but it's still a valid means. It still has the possibility to bring us to correct understanding. Yoga also accepts anumana, inference, and accepts agama, testimony from a reliable source. We'll speak much more about that when we consider the Yoga Sutra. But all this to say, the first school of the 6 classical schools of Indian philosophy is logic and epistemology. How do I decide if something is real? And it's a logical place to start. Vaisheshika continues in this very practical, let's say down-to-earth approach to reality. Vaisheshika includes the system of atomic physics. So it's more to do with the constituents of reality. How is reality built? So this Nyaya and Vaisheshika, logic and physics. Now logic and physics is a very, one might say, reasonable, rational, logical place to begin. However, do logic and physics account for everything in our experience as a human being? Obviously not. And there are some things in our life that we cannot quantify, that we cannot measure. The Indian system does not shrink back from that, and so we get Sankhya and Yoga. Now Sankhya, as we've maybe touched on already, looking at the tattvas, Sankhya means enumeration, and it gives us a depiction and a description of the way that the manifest realm of existence evolved from consciousness. The difference between Sankhya and Yoga, people debate this to some degree, but they say that Sankhya is Nirishwara. There's no God or higher power. It's just there's Purusha as consciousness, and there's nature, and then when they come together, it creates this stirring and together those two forces allow the manifestation of existence to happen. Yoga does include Ishvara, this idea of a consciousness that has will and has capacity. And these two are sister schools. Yoga builds upon the Sankhya model of reality, and in some yoga schools it builds upon it very significantly, particularly in tantric schools. So remember the tattvas sheet, we've got 25 constituent aspects, or tattvas or gunas of reality. In tantric schools, this will be extended into subtler realms. So there'll be more tattvas, 36 tattvas in the Yoga of Kashmir Shaivism, for example. And then we have the Mimamsa schools. So basically, Nyaya and Vaisheshika, if I want to explore reality, there's the idea that the Veda is full of truth. These are realized teachings. They're speaking about truths of existence. So the idea in that circle, in this point in the middle, is truth. And all these systems of knowledge and inquiry are helping us get a fuller picture of that nuanced, complex, mysterious reality. So Sankhya Yoga, the Sankhya model of the universe, gives us a very practical frame to explore, and it allows us to work with the mysterious, the immeasurable. And yoga is about, in this manifest realm of nature that's constantly changing, that's subject to birth and death and constant change in between those two great changes, yoga is about cultivating balance, harmony, integration here and now in the reality of our birth. Once one becomes more and more established in that unity consciousness, in that integrated state of awareness, there's the idea that the Mimamsa schools, their approach can help us deepen our connection to that state. Purva Mimamsa, Purva means like previous or prior, and Uttara, the ultimate part. The previous part, Purva Mimamsa, is basically all about ritual action and how we can act in ways and perform rituals and do certain things that are part of human life in ways that allow us to deepen that integration. And then Uttamimamsa, also known as Vedanta, is really about refining our intellect and the subtle tools of our awareness so we can, again, deepen our connection to that unified state, that more inclusive, holistic state of being and awareness. So hopefully that gives a little bit of an overview of these 6 darshanas, these 6 different lenses through which we can consider reality and approach reality and approach life. Let's pause there.